Hi, we're back again with Associate Chief Justice O'Connor, and we'd like to cover in this next segment a little bit about public inquiries. As you may know, Dennis has been the commissioner on two very important commissions, one ordered by the provincial government of Mike Harris that dealt with the Walkerton water scandal, I guess you could refer to it. Dennis will correct me probably. And the second one appointed by the federal government to deal with the inquiry into the Mahar Arar case. And Dennis will be able to give us some good insight into that. As I understand it, the process of an inquiry is much like that of conducting a trial, or is there more involved?
Well, there are some aspects of it that are similar to conducting a trial, but really the fundamental purpose of a public inquiry is different than a trial. Governments call public inquiries for the purpose of typically for investigating something that's gone wrong, seriously wrong, and for the purpose of making recommendations so that it doesn't happen again. So that in our legal framework, public inquiries are comparatively rare. And it's only when government is of the view that the normal institutions that would respond to something that's gone wrong, take the water tragedy in Walkerton. In 2000, the municipal water system became contaminated, 7 people died, 2,000 people became sick. It was a tragedy. So that it's only when the normal institutions that would look into that, there's a concern that they won't be able to deal with it thoroughly, possibly independently, that government creates a special body to do it, a public inquiry. And the purpose of a public inquiry, unlike a trial, is not to make findings of liability, civil or criminal. That's not the purpose. It simply finds facts and reports on them as to what happened, so that the public will then know, we know what went wrong in Walkerton. Here's why it happened. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, to make recommendations, again in the case of Walkerton, so that that type of thing does not happen again. And so that's typically what a public inquiry is all about. In the course of doing that, like a trial, the commission may call witnesses who are examined by lawyers and so on, but at its base, it is a different process.
Okay, so when you were appointed the commissioner for the Walkerton inquiry, it was up to you to appoint your own staff, lawyers, recorders, expert testimony. You directed all of that.
Yeah. One of the things that's important about a public inquiry is that it be independent. And the reason for creating the inquiry is because of the need in the public's mind to have an independent investigation. So there's no doubt about it's going to be thorough and credible, hopefully. And for that reason, governments often ask judges to do it, although they don't have to, but they most often do. And the significance of the independence is once the inquiry starts underway, then, as you point out, the commissioner has control of the process and basically, within the mandate, can do what's necessary, either by hiring people, including experts, lawyers, whatever, to assist with the investigation so that they can get to the bottom of the problem and then air it publicly so the public knows exactly what the problem had been.
You were kind enough to supply me with your written reports, which I found very well done and very informative and very thorough. And I noticed that there were two distinct parts, and you sort of pointed that out. One, examining the cause, why it happened, and the second part, recommendations that you would think needed to be implemented in order to prevent such things happening. Moving on to the idea of attaching blame as you pointed out, it's not one of the mandates that a commission has. Although I'm sure that you do find fault, it's not your mandate to impose sentences or anything like that.
In reporting on, again, using Walkerton as an example, it was necessary on the facts to point out what went wrong. I mean, something seriously went wrong. And so that as part of describing what seriously went wrong, it is necessary to say where some people or some institutions fell down on the job. So that in that sense, one could say, well, there's blame or fault finding. The purpose of the inquiry, however, is not to set out to punish and not to set out to impose any penalties. It's simply, as I said earlier, is to report so that the public, hopefully at the end of it, will say, well, we're confident we know what went wrong, we see the recommendations. The recommendations in Walkerton were directed at ensuring the safety of the drinking water system for all Ontarians across the province. So they were comprehensive. And the purpose of that would be to bring comfort that we have a good and sound drinking water system as we go ahead.
Well, I know you're a bit of a city slicker, if I can use that term, and I recall you telling me that part of what you thought was a responsible thing to do would be to visit one of the farms in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And having arrived at one such farm with your entourage, you proceeded to enter the barn, and the smell was not what you're used to. And so, after a brief moment, you said, I think I get the picture.
I think it was a pig farm, and there was
Pig farm.
one of the concerns in the safety of drinking water, and I don't mean to make light of it at all, was that that we have what were becoming very large farms that were could be sources of contamination for water systems that eventually become drinking water. And so that one of the issues that we had to grapple with was what regulations, if any, there should be for these types of farms. And the farms are enormously important for providing food to people, and we can't get by without them. So that as part of that exercise, as you mentioned, I visited actually a number of farms, and it was very important to hear from the farmers and the agricultural community about what type of regulation made sense and what type of regulations did not make sense. And they were very helpful and involved in that part of the inquiry.
Good. And I recall talking to you briefly, not very long after you concluded the inquiry. And I believe you attribute the Walkerton experience, the tragedy as you call it, to having a lot to do with efforts to clean up some of our rivers and waterways. Am I correct on that?
In the recommendations that I made, started with looking at the protecting of water sources, so that we draw our water either from lakes or rivers or from aquifers. And so the thought is that if those become contaminated, while the water can be treated, it becomes a more risky exercise and can be a more expensive exercise. So that a sensible first step in getting safe drinking water is to limit, within reasonable limits, the amount of contamination or pollution that we have in our water sources. So that there were some recommendations in the Walkerton report which were directed at providing an organized system for trying to plan the use of water sources and try to regulate to some extent the amount of pollution that would take place, would be permitted. And in the years since the Walkerton report, the government has announced publicly that it has implemented those types of recommendations.
So you're satisfied with your recommendations have been accepted and implemented, or do you feel more needs to be done?
I actually don't know that answer, and the reason I don't is I made the report with the recommendations. What I can say is that the government, the provincial government, has said within the last few years that it has implemented all of the recommendations. Now, I have no reason to doubt what they
Right.
say, but I also have no reason to sort of look into it, and it would be a complicated matter. What I can say about the Walkerton report, though, was when I delivered the first report, it did have a series of recommendations. The then government, the Conservative government, said that they would implement those recommendations. By the time, I think, no, and by the time the second report came along, or shortly thereafter, there had been a change of government, but the subsequent government announced it would implement them. As I say, I have no reason to doubt what they say that they've
Right.
done it, but who knows?
And do you consider the conclusion of that inquiry to be a highlight in your career? Did you enjoy the work? Was it something that you felt proud of because you had helped to protect an important resource for Ontarians?
Yeah, I thought I was pleased with the work. It was difficult work. There was, particularly in terms of making the recommendations, I got a lot of help from experts, both local and from afar. And there were some difficult policy choices to be made, having listened to the debates on the policy issues. I had an expert advisory panel of really top Canadians who dealt with the various issues involved in the safety of drinking water and benefited enormously from their help, so that one tends to say, well, it's the O'Connor report and his recommendations, but really it's the product of the views and efforts of a wide spectrum of people.
And I noticed that you selected as, I believe he was your lead attorney, an Italian.
Right, I did.
Is it Paul Cavaluso?
Paul Cavaluso, yeah.
Well, I think you made a good choice.
That's right, because of his Italian heritage.
Certainly.
Well, I think my admiration for Italians started way back in high school when I met you.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Okay, let's move on to the second inquiry that you were appointed to be in charge of. And it dealt with an entirely different situation, which I think is a good indication of how flexible a judge has to be in his expertise and his writing skills and in his organizing, fact-finding endeavor. And that inquiry was the Mahar Arar situation that involved, again, very complicated issues. How would you summarize your experience there?
But just briefly, by way of background, Mr. Arar was a Canadian citizen who was detained in JFK Airport in New York, held for 12 days in the United States, removed to Syria where he was imprisoned for a year, and I think in unbelievably bad conditions, and abused during that year. Ultimately, he returned to Canada, and the government called this inquiry. The inquiry was focused on looking at the role that Canadian officials played in what happened to Mr. Arar. And one of the challenges, there was a number of conducting the inquiry, is that a lot of the information that related to the Canadian investigations, which were CSIS and the RCMP primarily, was subject to claims of national security confidentiality. It couldn't be heard in public, quite legitimately so.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and there was a big exercise that we all had to go through in sorting out what could be made public and what could not be made public. So the process I finally struck on had me hearing all of the evidence in camera, behind closed doors, and then making decisions after having heard it all, and then conducting public hearings with that portion of the evidence over which there was no confidentiality concerns, and that's what we did. And ultimately, we were able to have in the public domain enough information that I was able to report publicly in a coherent way about what happened, so that while not all of the information could be disclosed publicly, and it was nonetheless, we worked together with the government. I was able to come with a report that I think depicted enough information to disclose enough of the evidence and tell the story.
And so your recommendations out of that particular inquiry, would they have been as extensive as the ones from Walkerton?
No. There are two types of recommendations. One is what happened with respect to the investigation and what I found to be some shortcomings on the part of the Canadians. First of all, I'd emphasize, I'm not sure it's always reported this way, I found that there was no bad faith or malicious behavior on the part of Canadian officials. So
That's comforting.
yeah, that is comforting, and that was the first finding. What I did find was that, short of that, information that was inaccurate through mistake, whatever, was communicated to American authorities, which could be misleading about Mr. Arar's role in the investigation that was being carried out and perhaps any threat that he posed. So that, and the recommendations then, the point of this is the recommendations that I made had to do with avoiding that type of problem in the future. Well, I mean, I start out by saying it is important that Canada, and this is an essential point, in conducting national security investigations, cooperate with other countries. Have to. Cooperation starts with information sharing. Have to do it. Simple recommendation, when you're sharing information, make sure it's correct. If you're uncertain about it, say so.
Right.
So that, when you say RV is extensive, I mean, I'm oversimplifying it to an extent, but no, on that part of the inquiry, I thought the recommendations were fairly straightforward.
And so, how much of the misinformation that was passed on was, and this is maybe not a fair question to ask, you can decline to answer if you choose, but how much of it was due to pressure from the United States in terms of trying to either cover up what they had done or justify their actions?
I don't think, when I'm asked questions about this, I have to be careful, but I don't think there's anything to suggest that the Americans pressured Canadians to pass misinformation at all.
Well, I think that's what a lot of Canadians that I have spoken with, not a lot, but the people that had followed the inquiry were concerned that that was an issue. The other issue is you had nothing to do in any of your recommendations in awarding a settlement
No, I
to
didn't.
Arar.
That was something the government did after, but I think in fairness, on the basis of the report and the findings, the government entered into a settlement with them after the inquiry was completed.
Okay. So it never did go to trial, there was no civil suit?
No. I'm not sure, there may have been a civil suit started, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But in any event, there was no trial, there was an out-of-court settlement as a result of negotiations between the government and Mr. Arar.
Mm-hmm. As I've mentioned in the past in some of our interchanges, I think you're supremely qualified to be a judge that decides the fate of so many people.
No, thank you.
I certainly wouldn't put my trust in anyone as much as I put it in you. So,
That's a high praise.
well, you should be proud of yourself. I consider you a great friend and a great citizen of this country.
Well, thank you very much.
So thank you for everything we've done so far, and we will be doing more in our series. I just want to finish by putting my hand on Dennis's knee so